Hello and welcome to a new episode of Leonid's Live Lounge. And today I'm very happy to say that we have Nicholas Bentley joining us. Nicholas and I have known each other for years now. I don't actually think I want to put a number on it, but
almost
it
double
has been,
digits, almost double digits, I would say.
I was going to say yes, because to give you a bit of background about Nicholas, he is currently the head of Global Legal Sanctions at Novartis, and you've been with Novartis for the past 8 years. And I know that we initially started speaking when you were at Syngenta, your previous company, as their head of trade compliance. So I guess that ages our relationship in some way, at least.
It does, in a positive way too, because it gives me enough years in Switzerland that I can finally start the citizenship process as of this year. And it's a minimum of 10 years you have to be in Switzerland. So it's positive that we can age the relationship that long, Jamie.
There we go. I enjoy the positive spin on that. But yeah, Nicholas and I have shared many a lunch and many a dinner over that time. But I'm really glad that you've joined us today, Nicholas, to give your perspective on what you're seeing in this, I guess, tumultuous world of trade and sanctions,
Yes.
and hear how Novartis is also dealing with that. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, Jamie. Really timely to have this conversation now, beginning of January, and actually just a few days before the annual World Economic Forum is held in Davos, Switzerland, starting next week, where trade is actually going to be very, very prominent on the agenda. So we've got no less than the Novartis CEO, Vas Narasimhan, who's going to be on a panel talking about the many different shapes of global trade. One of my bosses, Karen Hale, the Chief Legal Officer, will also be attending the World Economic Forum at Davos. So for any colleagues listening to the podcast today who are either working in trade compliance or interested in working in trade compliance, it's certainly a very, very timely topic. There are some major leaders out there who are being asked to speak on panels really kind of in the most prominent fora that have existed for many years.
I mean, it's amazing to hear that it has, as it should be, at the sort of the top of the priority list for, Novartis being one of the biggest pharmaceutical businesses out there, and the CEO is there talking about the importance of global trade at one of the biggest, most well-known annual conferences. So if we need an example of how trade is seen at the moment, that's a great one. So yeah, as you say, great timing to have this conversation. And let's dive into that a little bit more. I mean, when you look at trade compliance today, especially around sanctions, what's keeping you up at night? What trends are really shaping the landscape at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I say when I look at the sanctions landscape, the thing that keeps me up at night is just the sheer velocity and complexity of change. So when I first met Jamie years ago, I think it was 2017, most of my legal advisory work back then was focused on really one dominant sanctions authority, and that was the United States, and particularly the Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, which has been around for decades, and they have all the institutional knowledge that an agency like that would be able to amass over decades. In 2025, we saw, no surprise, OFAC make a number of new designations of entities and companies, 2,200 new designations. In fact, this was actually a 30% drop from the previous year. So there was a slight decrease in designations in 2025. But at the same time, other jurisdictions have picked up the pace, and notably the European Union, where the European Commission in Brussels is the lead authority when it comes to actually spearheading sanctions policy. The United Kingdom has become more and more active with sanctions policy, the creation of OTC being one example, the Office for Trade Sanctions Implementation. My home country, Canada, has become increasingly active. And then the country where I live and work and hope to at some point soon become a citizen, Switzerland, has also become more and more active when it comes to not only just implementing European Union sanctions in order to be, let's say, not a jurisdiction for circumventing European Union sanctions, but Switzerland's also become more active with enforcement activity. So all of this has created a more complex, but also more fragmented regulatory environment for global companies like Novartis to navigate. It's no longer sufficient to just simply look at, do we have any touch points with the United States? Do we have any any kind of U.S. nexus with certain transactions? Do we have a touch point, for example, with the U.S. financial system? People, lawyers, and trade compliance professionals working in this area really have to become more fluent and comfortable with these multiple different jurisdictions that I mentioned. I think another interesting theme that at times keeps me up at night would be the fact that regulators are now moving to a point where they're not just targeting end users. They're looking at the whole ecosystem of certain businesses. So, for example, logistics networks, financiers, facilitators, in some cases, lawyers who are advising certain oligarchs, consultants who are advising cryptocurrency businesses. The whole system that supports certain business transactions is now being scrutinized, and that means that certain traditional country-based risk models just don't work the way that they used to work. So, so in whatever industry one is working in, understanding the different players and different actors who are involved in that industry, be it certain vessels, be it logistics providers, be it banks, understanding where the risks are, where the risky actors might be, that's very important, I think.
I agree, and I think still for a lot of companies out there, what's keeping them up at night is they still don't feel that they've got enough or sufficient in-house expertise in this space, or they need to be so fast-paced and fast-moving now to respond to sanctions, and they still are trying to bring the right talent in-house to do that. So, and at the same time, I mean, we're not getting to this as much now. You've also got the tariffs that throw
Yes.
a whole load of new complications on top. So yeah, lots to keep you busy.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jamie, that in 2025, tariffs, in particular, of course, US tariffs, really did kind of fall into the trade compliance shop. It doesn't mean that only trade compliance professionals or trade compliance lawyers are working on that topic. Of course, there were plenty of supply chain folks. At Novartis, we've got finance colleagues, tax colleagues. We've got kind of a cross-functional team involved in that tariffs topic. But if not sleepless nights, there were certainly some difficult sleep nights last March and April when this topic became a really hot one, including for the pharmaceutical industry. On our side, we did have certain agreements that were concluded, certain company-specific tariff agreements that were concluded in December. That's given us a little bit of additional comfort or relief. But this universe of tariffs is a dramatic new development for anybody who's either working in trade compliance or interested in working in trade compliance. I don't think it's a topic which should only be left to supply chain colleagues alone. It's something where due to increased enforcement risks, increased attention being paid by the Department of Justice into customs valuation fraud, misclassification of imported items. This is a brand new area of increased enforcement priority. And I would argue that's a good reason for companies to make sure they have the right trade compliance colleagues and the right lawyers in place to address that new enforcement risk.
As if those in trade weren't already busy enough.
Yes.
Let's throw more on top. But yeah, exciting times. And trade compliance is an interesting space because you don't want to be seen as a department doesn't want to be seen as just a something that says no or blocks business, and it can operate in sort of grey areas. I mean, how do you balance staying compliant, of course, while also enabling the business to move fast?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, it starts with building a principles-based compliance framework, one that's designed for addressing ambiguity. There's not always going to be crystal clarity. Even with the thousands of OFAC FAQs that have been published over the last several decades, even with the growing number of European Commission FAQs that have been published in relation to the EU sanctions against Russia, there are plenty of gray zones. And it takes a certain calmness, a certain comfort with ambiguity, a certain collaborative spirit to sit down and have those discussions with key stakeholders when it comes to understanding how to maintain business continuity in certain markets, like Russia, for example, or in some cases like China. Yeah, and that means sitting down, having a risk deep dive, an operational assessment, for example, with each of the 19 sanctions packages that the European Commission has published since February 2022, 19 packages targeting Russia. Each of those has, on the Novartis side, prompted a trade compliance-led operational deep dive to understand what are the impacts on the business. And that deep dive involves colleagues from different functions: legal, supply chain, finance, our local country leaders in Russia, to just sit around together a virtual table and discuss what does it mean for the business, what are the gray zones for us, and what are the questions we might need answered, or what are the questions we might need some support on from our industry association. So that's been a pretty interesting way of trying to tackle some of these gray areas, to, let's say, link up with peer companies in a compliant way with antitrust laws, of course, and do that through our industry association. And for Novartis, that's EFIA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry Associations.
Interesting. Okay, great. And you mentioned earlier, especially around tariffs, I think you mentioned it, is the importance of linking up with the supply chain and other functions. And, trade compliance, it doesn't operate in isolation. It does have to interact with many different parts of the business. And so for you, how do you collaborate with legal, supply chain, and commercial teams to manage risk effectively?
Yeah. So it's an absolute necessity, that collaboration. And I would say for any colleagues watching this podcast who might currently be working at a law firm, be it as a junior associate, a mid-level associate, senior associate, partner, any colleagues watching this who might work at a Big Four consultancy, one's ability to collaborate or not effectively is probably the key thing that makes or breaks an in-house career. So when I was first starting off my legal career at a law firm years ago in Brussels, I didn't know much about the in-house world. And in some ways, I probably naively, at that time, as a lawyer in his young 30s, at that point, I naively thought, well, in-house work probably is overall easier than the pace at a law firm. I would say overall, I was wrong. And what I see is that the soft skills that are required to succeed in an in-house environment really hinge on how well do you collaborate with other functions. Are you a problem solver? Are you a generally pleasant person to work with? Can you collaborate in a structured way? So, Jamie, to your question, I think the kind of tremendous changes in the trade compliance sphere, particularly since February 2022 and the start of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think having some formal governance structures help. I think that's more useful than scrabbling together and trying to get colleagues to meet on different topics in an ad hoc way. I think having a clear governance framework for managing, say, and owning a trade sanctions and export controls policy, that's kind of a no-brainer for every company in every industry. There has to be clear ownership of a policy, and therefore clear ownership of the controls and the risk assessments and the training that all should flow from a company's policy in the export controls and sanctions space. So that ownership, like governance ownership, I think is really, really important. But beyond the governance ownership, having a, let's say, kind of risk management committee when it comes to certain active issues, that's really important. And that's where I think you need to have great commercial representation. So at Novartis, like at a lot of companies, since 2022, we've had an emergency committee in place to manage all of the challenges we have in supplying life-saving medicines to Russia. That was a committee we put in place in early 2022. We have something similar in place for Belarus. Our company, like other companies, may in the coming weeks put in place a similar committee for Iran, given what's been happening over the last couple of weeks with the protests in Iran.
Of course.
So that's an important aspect as well. Having a emergency committee in place that has excellent representation of commercial leaders, finance leaders, trade compliance colleagues, and legal colleagues. That's important to be able to kind of feel mutually supported and just have that structure in place for talking about difficult subjects sometimes, difficult commercial and even ethical topics. Should we continue investments? Yes, no, in X market. Should we continue clinical trials? Yes, no, in X market. Are our people safe? Are employees safe in this market? Is there a high security risk in allowing employees to travel to that market? I mean, these are all topics that benefit from discussion in a risk management committee rather than having one lawyer like me give the thumbs up or thumbs down.
Mm. No, makes sense. I think just to add to a couple of your points earlier on there, I mean, one, I agree. I think people moving from law firm or big four or federal agency in-house, or it's a more difficult transition, I think, than most expect,
Yes,
to move into corporate life, and the learning curve, it can be quite a bit, and some will struggle with it initially. It is like you mentioned, it's a bigger move, I think, than a lot of people initially expect. And then secondly, with regards to the importance of soft skills, I completely agree. When I'm working with a client on a new search, I focus more of my attention on what sort of personality fit are you looking for? What's the culture
yes,
of the team? What's the culture of the company? Of course, technical knowledge would always be important, but you can write the best export control policy or the best training document. But if you aren't able to build trust and build relationships with stakeholders, there won't be buy-in to it, and it will
yes.
remain just a piece of paper or just a training document. So yeah, I think I completely agree. The soft skills nowadays in this world is more important than ever.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jamie. And what I would say as well is, in thinking to your original question, how do you collaborate between
Mm.
legal, supply chain, commercial? I think in doing that collaboration, understanding that and being humble enough to admit that sometimes you, like myself or others, might make some missteps. There might
Mhm.
sometimes be some miscommunication. There might be some very high sensitivity when it comes to, for example, the emergency committee meetings discussing
Mm.
events in Iran or discussing events in Russia. If colleagues are actually based in those countries, they're going to be experiencing just a whole different level of stress and,
Yep.
frankly, high cortisol levels compared to an employee like myself in legal sitting in Basel, Switzerland, which is certainly not experiencing the same kind of events that Tehran is currently today, or colleagues in finance or in tax who just might not have the same perspective as those colleagues who are in country, have a closer relationship with the market, understand some of the challenges a bit better. So just kind of, I guess, having that openness to feedback, embracing the need to develop our soft skills as we collaborate with others, and just kind of adapt. Listen to others'
Mm.
needs, understand that perhaps occasionally we might have to seek more input from others to fully understand the big picture, and we might have to at times adapt our guidance to take account of the perspectives of others. So let's say overall, being open to guidance and feedback, and um, having the appropriate level of rigidity. Let's say.
Yeah. Seek first to understand, as they say.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, okay. Perfect. One other area I think would be interesting. So I've heard multiple times, the phrase "sanctions is the new FCPA" or something along those lines. Are there any recent enforcement actions or sanctions cases that offer lessons for companies navigating global compliance?
Yeah, yeah. So I think we could say probably that overall 2025 didn't have the same kind of big ticket
Mm.
enforcement actions that we've seen in certain other kind of famous years,
Yeah.
like the famous $9 billion fine against BNP Paribas that was
Mhm.
announced. I think it was 2015. I mean, those years in the mid 2010s had the really eye popping multi-billion-dollar fines against so many major financial institutions. So we haven't had quite that quantum of penalties announced in 2025.
Mm. That's what I
That
thought.
said, we are seeing certain trends, and certain trends that should be of interest to people working in trade compliance or
Mhm.
interested in working in trade compliance. So one example is more enforcement actions against individuals.
Yep.
Uh, and that could theoretically be directors and officers at companies, including companies we work for. One example last year was a real estate investor who was fined $4.6 million for knowingly dealing in property linked to a sanctioned Russian. And this basically sends a message: look, sanctions compliance is no longer just a corporate headquarter level responsibility. There can be some pretty major repercussions for an individual. So that's one lesson I think we saw in 2025. Excuse me. I think another lesson that came out of last year is the need to invest in tools or external vendors who can provide more information regarding ownership structures of customers, particularly customers linked to Russia. There was a company called Haas Automation that was fined over $1 million because it didn't adequately assess the ownership structure of customers linked to Russia. So that's an important one. Sanction party screening is no longer just about screening your banks, customers, and vendors. There has to be that next level digging into ownership structures in order to really reduce your risk level as a company, especially if you are operating in these higher risk jurisdictions like Russia, like Belarus, obviously like Iran. I guess the last note I would make about enforcement actions last year was that there was one, let's say, relatively high penalty that was announced. It wasn't the multi-billion-dollar penalty, but it was still a significant quantum, and that was $215 million US penalty against a company called GVA Capital. And this particular case underscored the theme that I mentioned earlier on in our podcast interview, which is that OFAC is now more interested in the entire ecosystem of actors that are involved in supporting certain industries. So this case tells us something about how OFAC treats gatekeeper liability. Investment managers, advisors, brokers, anyone who's in a position to detect and prevent exposure to sanctioned persons. So there were some missteps in this particular case by individuals who were involved in these kind of gatekeeper activities. So that's the third and final theme that I would call out from the enforcement actions last year. Maybe one final comment thinking about enforcement this year in 2026. I think companies should expect the Department of Justice in the US to keep taking an increased interest in tariffs evasion, given the importance that the Trump administration is placing on, frankly, the revenue raising opportunities of tariffs. Companies are going to be under scrutiny for customs valuation practices, for misclassification of imports into the US and misclassifying the customs codes of certain items. This is going to be an increasing topic of interest, I believe, by the US Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, but also by the Department of Justice, which has actually set up a new task force to look at these issues. So if you're working at a company in trade compliance or legal, and you haven't really yet had anything to do with tariffs or asked even kind of to what degree your company has US tariff exposure, I think this is a good time to do so now, starting 2026.
I agree. I think it's interesting because it will almost be, tariffs and the enforcement of tariffs as a political weapon. It could be an interesting year to see what happens in that space.
Yes, absolutely. Probably my old international trade law textbook from my law school days is probably not visible behind me on the bookshelves. But when I was doing those studies over 10 years ago, at that point, I guess it was almost 20. My goodness, it was actually 20 years ago. Wow, I'm aging myself now. But at that point in time, most of what we were discussing when it came to tariffs was kind of the long, inexorable trend of reducing them worldwide and reducing them within the framework of successive rounds of World Trade Organization negotiations. It was kind of, they were this artifact, this historical artifact of the 1930s, and there have been this kind of successive series of rounds of WTO, well, previously GATT negotiations, and then after 1995, WTO negotiations that were reducing tariffs. So it's just been a remarkable change historically, actually seeing what's happened last year.
Yeah, I think a slight understatement.
Yeah.
there. But
Yeah.
but yeah, okay, great. One thing as well that you mentioned earlier, I think it would be good to pick back up on. You mentioned about the importance of soft skills these days, if in a trade compliance professional. I mean, if you were hiring someone for your trade compliance team tomorrow, what skills, what qualities for you would be non-negotiable?
Yeah. Great question. Thanks, Jamie. I would look for four things.
Hmm.
First, judgment under ambiguity. So
Okay.
when
Yep.
U.S. designations of Iran-linked parties jump by more than 1,500% in a year, which is what happened last year, and if your
Mm.
company has any exposure to that market, you need to be hiring people who can adapt and think critically about just how
Yeah.
to handle that wave of new designations.
Yeah.
Number two, cross-functional communication. So we talked about this
100%.
before, how to best collaborate with other functions in an in-house environment. Sanctions risk, and I would say export controls risks, touches every part of a modern business:
Yep.
procurement, legal, finance, commercial, logistics. You need people who can translate complexity into
Yep.
actionable guidance, and frankly, do so in a very concise manner. Keep those emails short. Third, and this is a no-brainer, technical and analytical ability.
Hmm.
So familiarity in the trade compliance area with screening tools, ownership mapping, data-driven risk identification, including using AI tools. These are becoming core competencies
Yep.
because sanctions now target networks and not just individual entities or companies. And then fourth and finally, a global mindset. So someone
Mm.
who understands that U.S. sanctions and export controls are not just the dominant set of rules as they were when I was starting my international trade law career, but that they are now one very important,
Of course.
but still only one piece of a larger regulatory interplay of different sanctions and export controls jurisdictions. So I mentioned earlier in our discussion the rise of UK sanctions and export controls,
Hmm. Hmm.
European Union sanctions and export controls, Swiss sanctions and export controls, my home country, Canadian export controls and sanctions. But fifth and finally, Chinese sanctions and
I was
export
going to ask about
controls.
that.
So,
Yeah.
so thinking about, excuse me, do colleagues have an openness to understanding what is developing in China? Are there maybe
Mm.
Mandarin skills in your team, or an openness to learning Mandarin, an ability to liaise with colleagues in China? That's a pretty important aspect as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. A couple of points from what you said there. I think, as you mentioned, technical knowledge is a given. However, we've noticed it because now trade compliance is the sort of hot topic, the area that's getting attention. We're already seeing on resumes, people adding buzzwords of trade compliance and sanctions to make themselves look like they're more involved in that space. And it's only a short conversation with them that I can tell that they've not had that hands-on experience that you'd need. It's
Interesting.
so it just shows that it is becoming the desirable place to be. But yeah, you still need to be able to delve into, okay, what actual technical acumen do they have and how have they implemented that knowledge in a business. So I think that's an interesting part. And then I think the
Yeah.
US centric part that you mentioned also really important. I mean, over 50% of our business last year was US, so we do a lot of work
Yes.
there. And we still have that with certain people with certain experiences where they have really only experienced things from a US perspective. Even if they're in
Yes.
global multinational organizations, the US is what they look at, and the rest can kind of, oh, we'll deal with that afterwards, but we need to get the US right. Which, of course, the US will always remain and still is the dominant sanctions policy to look at. But as you mentioned, you can't just focus on that these days
Yes.
as well. And then China is a whole other topic that
Yeah.
is keeping many trade leaders and companies up at night as well. And what we've noticed is, whereas previously we may have had Asia Pacific regional trade compliance officers, in Singapore covering the whole region, we're now seeing it where almost China is set as a separate region. So you'll have an
Interesting.
APAC trade compliance officer excluding China, and then you'll have someone
Yes.
on the ground in China, or someone maybe in Singapore or another location that's covering
Yes.
China, and they would expect to have hands-on experience on the ground in China, Mandarin speaking, and can understand how the nuances of working in that market. And I think many companies are still looking to catch up in that space as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. All great points. I mean, really just sort of my advice to companies and leaders in legal, leaders in trade compliance would be, don't sleep on China. China is developing its export controls regime very quickly. They're watching, they're learning, they're developing their export controls framework. We could, in a few years, reach a point where we have Chinese export controls increasingly following the product the way we have with the U.S. Export Administration Regulations, EAR, whereas many people watching this podcast will know U.S. export controls do, in many cases, actually follow the product no matter where it is in the world, including an in-country transfer that's made in certain markets. We might reach that point more and more with China's export control framework. So it's a fascinating area of growth and a professional opportunity for colleagues who are interested in China as a market, interested in China's legal framework. My team at Novartis Legal, I actually have a part-time secondee. She's a legal counsel based in China, in our China legal team, but she's now in year 2 of doing a part-time secondment with me, partly because I think she rightly recognizes the strategic advantage of upskilling herself in this area of sanctions, export controls, and trade compliance. There aren't a lot of lawyers, to my knowledge, in China who have this knowledge.
I concur. I agree. There isn't a big pool of lawyers that do that. So I think it will help us stand out in the market there. Interesting. I mean, we kind of discussed a little bit how things have changed over the last 10 years. We've also looked at where things are at the moment. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Nicholas, and ask to look into the crystal ball and looking ahead. What advice? Where would you start? What advice would you give to companies that want to build high-performing trade compliance functions capable of staying ahead of all these regulatory changes?
Yeah.
What do you think?
So I think biggest piece of advice is to design your corporate sanctions and export controls and trade compliance program for a multi-jurisdictional world. If your corporate policy or guideline has not been updated for a few years, probably if you open it up and have a look at it, you would find that it makes a lot of references to the United States and maybe not that many references to other jurisdictions that increasingly matter. And we've mentioned them during this podcast, the UK, the European Union, Canada, Switzerland, and China. So really understanding that these jurisdictions are ramping up their own hiring of analysts, of enforcement officers. They matter more and more. So companies need to be making sure they have controls in place that take into account the increased enforcement activities that are happening across all of those different regimes other than the United States. Number 2 is being comfortable in investing in intelligence and analytics. So sanctions now increasingly focus on facilitation networks, shipping routes, logistics companies, financial intermediaries. Depending on the kind of company at which you work, you need systems and people who can detect the patterns behind the scenes. And I think this is where there's just fascinating developments happening with artificial intelligence tools offered by various different companies. I won't mention them during this podcast, but for any colleagues who are perhaps going to join Jamie and me in Zurich on, I think it's March 11th or 12th, the Nielsen Smith conference on sanctions and export controls in the life sciences. There's going to be at least one company there that is offering a pretty sophisticated system that can help spot these kind of patterns, can basically provide sort of an analytical suite of tools to detect patterns in your business transactions that could suggest a violation of sanctions and export controls. Number 3, anticipate enforcement escalation. So as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, 2025 wasn't, let's say, the standout year for the overall quantum of penalties, at least on the US side. The overall quantum was actually under $1 billion, so it wasn't sort of tremendously huge. But that said, we are having more enforcement activities being done by certain European Union member states. So enforcement doesn't happen at the EU Commission level. Instead, it happens at the member state level. And there are member states that are bulking up their resources to do so. And they're putting in place communication tools with other jurisdictions. So for example, Switzerland, I think it was last May, Switzerland signed a memorandum of understanding standing with the United States, with
Hmm.
the Department of Treasury, OFAC, to share information that might be relevant for sanctions violations and enforcement activity. So the communication channels between government authorities are becoming more formalized. In some cases, they're even providing secondees to go and work in other jurisdictions. So
Interesting.
OFAC has had for the past few years a secondee who's worked at, I think it's the UK OFSI, the Office of Financial Sanctions
Yep.
Implementation. So it's interesting stuff, and it just shows
Mm.
the breaking down of historical barriers to cooperation. And what this means ultimately is that we may have more and more multi-jurisdictional sanctions enforcement actions that happen. And so that's
Mm.
another reason to be aware of all the different jurisdictions in which your company may be exposed. And then finally, fourth and finally, would be build agility into your operating model. So regulatory volatility, I would even say explosive volatility,
Hmm.
and even
Yep.
geopolitical volatility. That's here to stay, at least I think for the next I would argue the next decade. So the strongest compliance programs in sanctions and export controls have short decision cycles, clear
Yep.
escalation routes, and a culture of collaboration. If there's one theme that comes out of this podcast, I think it's that the importance of that soft skill of embracing a culture of cross-functional collaboration within your company.
Yeah, I think the volatility and being quick to adapt is such an important part. I think a lot of time with trade compliance and what goes on in the news at the moment, it just always reminds me of that Mike Tyson quote that everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face, and
Yes.
it feels like it
Yeah.
has been a little bit like that over the last few years. But
Yes.
keeps us on our toes, at
Yeah.
least. Yeah,
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
great.
But what a fascinating time to be working in this field. I mean,
Yeah,
is trade compliance still a niche field of work in the in a corporate structure? To some degree, yes, but I think it's become a much broader niche area, and it's become core to so many businesses. I mean, trade, understanding trade policy, trade related risks. This is, as I was saying earlier, this stuff is I mean, there are panels that are on
yeah,
this next week at the World Economic Forum in Davos. So perhaps niche is in fact no longer the correct word when it comes to discussions of trade compliance. It's really becoming strategically critical to
yeah.
the operation of big corporates, but also smaller companies and emerging sectors like cryptocurrency, like emerging financial institutions.
Yeah, look, one of our previous guests on this Leonid Live Lounge, Ted Ganton of Siemens
Yes.
Healthineers. One thing I know he says a lot is, of course, it's busy at the moment for everything in trade, but it's also such a unique opportunity to be seen and heard and to be an advocate for your function and department at the moment. And
Yes.
we need to use this time, or sorry, you and the leaders in this space need to use this time effectively to make sure you are being heard when senior leaders are listening. So it's
Great
a
point.
very unique time at the moment.
Great point. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, Nicholas, look, thank you again so much for joining. It's been a really, really interesting conversation, and it's just great to hear your thoughts on what's going on. So yeah, hopefully people that have listened or watched this have enjoyed, have taken some information from it of use. And any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to Nicholas.
Yes.
And as he mentioned, he and I will be at the Nielsen Smith conference in Zurich in March, which will be able to get into all of this in more detail as well. So look forward to seeing you there, Nicholas, and have a great day.
Thanks so much, Jamie. It was great joining you today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.
Bye.